She was a mother. A queen. A grandmother. But when the throne was threatened, she didn't hesitate to kill her own blood. This is not a fairy tale. This is the true story of Athaliah, the only queen to sit on David's throne, and the only one to spill the blood of her grandchildren to keep it. What drives a woman to murder her legacy? Stay with me. Welcome to Mindful Musing, a journey with God, where faith comes alive, and every story reminds us that the God of yesterday is still the God of today. Here, we dive deep into the untold wonders of Scripture, immersive, emotional, powerful. Stories that stir your spirit, ignite your faith, and draw you closer to the heart of God. Subscribe now and join the journey, as we step into one of the most astonishing moments in all of biblical history. In the shadowed halls of Judah's palace, a woman once stood draped in royal silk, her eyes burning with ambition and fear. Her name was Athaliah, the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, wife to a king, and mother to a murdered heir. When the kingdom fell into chaos, Athaliah did the unthinkable, she turned against her own grandchildren to seize the throne. But what she didn't know, was that one child had survived. Hidden in a temple. Growing in secret. Waiting for justice. This is a story of blood and betrayal, of thrones and prophecies, of a queen who defied heaven, and the child destined to take her down. She was born in a palace, but not one filled with peace. From the moment Athaliah opened her eyes to the world, she was surrounded by lies, power, and a hunger for control. Her mother was Jezebel, yes, the same Jezebel whose name still sends a chill down the spine of every prophet. And her father, King Ahab, ruled the land of Israel with a heart far from God. Their home was not a place of worship or kindness. It was filled with golden idols and dark prayers to Baal, the false god. There were feasts with blood sacrifices, and prophets of the Lord were hunted, not honored. Athaliah grew up watching her mother command kings and her father bow to wickedness. This was the only kind of love she knew: power, fear, and control. As a child, Athaliah learned quickly. She learned that tears were weak, and that kindness would not keep her safe. Instead, she watched her mother's sharp eyes, her cold smile, and her dangerous charm. To win, Jezebel once whispered to her, "You must never care too much. Not about people. Not even about your own family." And so, Athaliah's heart began to grow cold. Years passed. Her beauty grew, and so did her ambition. One day, she was chosen to marry a prince from the kingdom of Judah. His name was Jehoram. It was a smart move. Her parents wanted to bring Baal worship into Judah too. And what better way to do it than through marriage? When Athaliah arrived in Jerusalem, the people were hopeful. She was elegant, noble, and strong. But they didn't see the storm behind her eyes. Jehoram, her husband, was not a kind man. Once he became king, he murdered all his brothers to make sure no one could take his throne. And standing beside him was Athaliah, silent, watching, approving. The same way she had seen her mother do back in Israel. And just like that, the door was opened. Baal worship entered Judah. The altars of the Lord were torn down. The sacred places were polluted. And the hearts of the people began to wander from their God. In time, Athaliah gave birth to a son, Ahaziah. You might think she'd feel love now. That maybe, just maybe, the warmth of holding her own child would melt the ice around her heart. But Athaliah didn't change. If anything, she grew colder. Her love for her son wasn't tender, it was strategic. He was her path to more power. She raised him to trust her above all else, to rule with her wisdom, and to follow her gods. And when Jehoram died, Ahaziah became king. But he didn't rule alone. Athaliah ruled through him. She whispered in his ear. She controlled his steps. She was the queen mother, but not the kind that rocked babies or told bedtime stories. She was the kind that sharpened knives and built kingdoms out of fear. For a time, it seemed like Athaliah had everything she wanted. She had power. She had her son on the throne. She had driven out the worship of the Lord. But Athaliah didn't change. If anything, she grew colder. Her love for her son wasn't tender, it was strategic. He was her path to more power. She raised him to trust her above all else, to rule with her wisdom, and to follow her gods. And when Jehoram died, Ahaziah became king. But he didn't rule alone. Athaliah ruled through him. She whispered in his ear. She controlled his steps. She was the queen mother, but not the kind that rocked babies or told bedtime stories. She was the kind that sharpened knives and built kingdoms out of fear. For a time, it seemed like Athaliah had everything she wanted. She had power. She had her son on the throne. She had driven out the worship of the Lord. But the skies over Judah were darkening. A storm was coming. And though Athaliah did not know it yet, the throne she fought so hard to protect would demand a terrible price. Because soon, her son would die. And her heart, twisted by years of control and pride, would drive her to do something that would shake the kingdom to its core. She would become a queen not of life, but of death. And the first victims, would be her very own grandchildren. The people thought Ahaziah was their king. They saw the crown on his head, the royal robe on his shoulders, and the golden scepter in his hand. But what they didn't see, was the shadow that moved behind him. The one who whispered in his ear. The one who pulled the strings like a puppeteer. That shadow, was Athaliah, his mother. After King Jehoram died, her son Ahaziah became king. He was young and unsure of himself. The weight of the kingdom rested on his shoulders, but his heart wasn't strong. So he turned to the only person he had always trusted, his mother. Athaliah stood tall beside him, dressed in fine royal robes, her face calm and proud. But inside, her heart burned with desire. This was her moment. She had waited for this. She had watched, planned, and whispered until the throne was within her reach. And now, though her son wore the crown, she was the true ruler of Judah. She led him to follow the same wicked paths she had learned as a child. She taught him to honor Baal instead of the God of his ancestors. Together, they brought back the false priests. The temple of the Lord grew quiet. The sounds of worship faded, and the smoke of strange sacrifices filled the air. The people began to lose hope. Some still prayed in secret. Others turned away from God altogether. Judah was drifting farther and farther from the truth. Ahaziah, under his mother's guidance, made a terrible mistake. He joined with the kings of Israel, the very people his grandfather Jehoshaphat had warned him about. They were going to war, and he wanted to prove himself strong. So, he followed them into battle, trusting in alliances more than in God. But it was a trap. In that war, Ahaziah was wounded and fled to the city of Megiddo to recover. But it was too late. Soldiers found him there, and he was killed. Just like that, he was gone. Athaliah's world shattered. Her son, her power, her plan, was taken from her. But she didn't cry. She didn't break. She didn't even mourn. Instead, her eyes grew colder. She returned to Jerusalem, and for the first time, she stood in the palace completely alone. No husband. No son. And now, no clear heir to the throne. The kingdom expected her to step aside. To let the next rightful heir, the children of her son, take the crown. But Athaliah had seen too much blood to stop now. She knew that as long as one of her grandchildren lived, the throne would never truly be hers. So she made a decision. A dark one. She would not step down. She would rise higher. Even if it meant stepping on the bodies of her own blood. The city of Jerusalem was quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet. No. This was the kind of silence that comes after something terrible has happened. The king was dead. King Ahaziah, the son of Athaliah, had been killed in battle. No trumpet sounded. No crowds wept in the streets. No songs of mourning were sung. Only whispers. The people didn't know what would happen next. Who would wear the crown now? Who would lead the nation? Judah had no king, no protector, and no direction. And in the middle of all that fear and confusion, Athaliah saw her chance. She didn't cry for her son. She didn't wear black or sit in ashes like grieving mothers often did. No. She sat tall on her throne, her face hard and dry. Because Athaliah didn't plan to let grief stop her. She planned to use it. She knew the next king should come from her son's children. He had sons, young princes, tiny royal heirs with innocent eyes and soft voices. They were the future of Judah. They were born to rule. And they were her own flesh and blood. But Athaliah's heart no longer beat with love. It beat with power. She had tasted the throne. She had held the scepter through her husband. Then through her son. And now, for the first time, she could rule in her own name. But there was one problem, the princes. Her grandsons. They stood in her way. And Athaliah didn't like to be blocked. In the dark chambers of the palace, she made a wicked choice. A choice so evil, it would stain her name forever in the scrolls of history. She gave the order. Kill them. All of them. Every royal child. Every possible heir to the throne. Every boy born of Ahaziah. Her own grandchildren. Tiny hearts. Little hands. Smiles that once reached out for her. Gone. One by one, the soldiers obeyed. The palace filled with the quiet screams of nurses, the muffled cries of children being taken from their beds. Blood was spilled, not by enemies, but by their own grandmother. Judah had never seen such a thing. A queen murdering her own house. When the killing was over, Athaliah stood alone. No more sons. No more grandsons. No rivals. Just silence and a throne. She crowned herself queen. Not just the queen mother. The queen. For the first time in the history of Judah, a woman sat on David's throne. But it was not a throne of peace. It was a throne soaked in blood. The people trembled. They remembered the stories of Jezebel, Athaliah's mother, the woman who had filled Israel with wickedness. Now, her daughter ruled over Judah, and her hands were just as cruel. But even in the shadows, even in the horror, hope was not dead. Because, unknown to Athaliah, one child had escaped. One tiny prince had been hidden away. And in the quiet corners of the temple, where the fire of the Lord still burned, a heartbeat continued. A heartbeat that would one day rise up. And bring down the queen who thought she had destroyed everything. The crown rested on Athaliah's head. It sparkled in the sunlight, but there was no joy in it. No glory. No songs were sung. No children danced in the streets. Because the people knew, that crown had been bought with the blood of innocence. It sat on her head like a curse. For 6 long years, Athaliah ruled Judah. She walked through the palace with her head high, her robes flowing behind her. She sat on the throne with a cold smile, giving orders and punishing anyone who dared question her. She filled the land with fear, fear of her, fear of Baal, fear of speaking the truth. And though she claimed to be queen, the people never truly accepted her. They whispered behind closed doors. They remembered the little princes. They remembered the blood. But no one dared rise up. Who could? The temple was silent. The priests were quiet. The streets were filled with her soldiers. And Athaliah made sure that every part of Judah served her and her gods. She built altars to Baal. She burned incense in high places. She replaced the priests of the Lord with men who served idols. Sacred places were polluted. The temple of God, once filled with singing and prayers, now stood in shadows. The land groaned under her rule. Mothers held their children tighter. Fathers prayed in silence. But even though Athaliah ruled on the outside, she was not at peace on the inside. In the deep parts of her heart, something stirred, a fear she could not name. A feeling that someone was watching. That something had been missed. That someone had survived. She had nightmares. Of small footsteps. Of tiny hands. Of young voices crying out in the night. Sometimes she would wake up breathless, her hands gripping the sheets, her eyes searching the shadows of her room. And still, she sat on her throne. A throne that once belonged to kings who followed God. To David. To Solomon. To Jehoshaphat. Now it was hers, but only through death. Each time she stepped into the royal court, she walked across the memory of what she had done. No matter how many guards she had, no matter how many laws she passed, the truth followed her like a shadow. Because you can rule a kingdom with fear. But you cannot silence heaven. And while Athaliah tried to bury the past under gold and idols, the Lord had already set a plan in motion. A small flicker of light was still burning in Judah. A tiny boy, alive, hidden, protected by the hand of God. He was growing in secret. And he was coming. Athaliah didn't know his name. She didn't know where he was. But heaven knew. And very soon, her throne, soaked in blood, would begin to tremble. While the palace echoed with the footsteps of soldiers and the cries of fear, deep within the walls of the temple, a miracle was growing. His name was Joash. He was only a baby when the soldiers came to kill the royal children. His brothers had been taken. His cousins had fallen. But just before they reached him, a brave woman named Jehosheba acted quickly. Jehosheba was the sister of Ahaziah, the very king Athaliah had lost, and she was married to Jehoiada, the high priest of the temple of the Lord. She knew what Athaliah had done. She had seen the blood. She had heard the whispers. But unlike so many others, she did not freeze in fear. She picked up little Joash in her arms and wrapped him in silence. His tiny face rested against her shoulder as she slipped past the guards, her heart pounding with every step. No one saw her. No one stopped her. By the time the soldiers reached Josh's room, he was already gone. Hidden. Safe. Alive. Jehosheba brought him to the temple. The one place Athaliah never dared to go. It was holy ground, set apart for the worship of the true God. Athaliah had replaced many priests with false ones, but she had not fully taken the temple. Not yet. Inside its stone walls, Joash was kept in secret. Only a few knew. The high priest Jehoiada became like a father to him. He taught him about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He told him stories of King David and King Solomon, of courage and faith. He reminded him that he was not just any boy, he was the rightful king of Judah. The boy grew. 1 year passed. Then another. And another. Outside, Athaliah ruled. But inside the temple, the future was being prepared. Joash played quietly in the courtyards, ran through the halls on silent feet, and listened carefully during the nighttime prayers. His heart grew strong. His mind grew sharp. And though he did not fully understand the danger that waited just beyond the temple walls, he knew he was different. He had a purpose. He had a calling. He had a destiny written by God himself. Athaliah believed she had wiped out every threat. She believed she was safe. But every time Joash laughed, or learned, or prayed, the ground beneath her throne trembled a little more. Because God always preserves a remnant. And when the time was right, he would rise. The sun rose quietly over Jerusalem, but inside the temple, hearts were burning with purpose. For 6 long years, Jehoiada the high priest had watched little Joash grow in secret. He had prayed over him. Taught him. Loved him like a son. And every day, as Joash became stronger, the weight on Jehoiada's heart grew heavier. He knew the boy was the true king. He also knew they couldn't hide forever. Athaliah still ruled with cruelty and fear. The temple was mostly silent now, its priests fewer, its doors watched. But Jehoiada believed something powerful: when God says it's time, no enemy can stop his plan. And now, it was time. Jehoiada called a secret meeting. He gathered the brave men who still served in the temple, priests, Levites, trusted guards. All of them had kept the secret of Joash for years. Their eyes widened when Jehoiada spoke. "We must crown the boy. Joash is the king by blood and by God's promise. If we delay, the darkness will only grow." Some were afraid. "Athaliah has soldiers," they whispered. "She will kill us all." But Jehoiada's eyes burned with fire. "If we stay silent, she wins. But if we act now, God will fight for us." Slowly, the men nodded. The plan began. Week by week, they moved in secret. Weapons were brought into the temple and hidden in rooms behind stone walls. Levites were placed at the gates, pretending to guard the temple for worship, but they were warriors now, watching for danger. And Joash was ready. He stood taller now, 7 years old, with eyes full of questions and a heart full of courage. He had never seen the palace. He had never sat on the throne. But he had been chosen. Jehoiada knelt before him one night and whispered, "You were born for this. Not by accident, but by the will of God. You are not just a boy. You are the light that will break the darkness." Tears filled Josh's eyes. He had always wondered why he was hidden. Now, he understood. The day came. It was the Sabbath, a day when many people came to the temple. Jehoiada gave his final orders. "Guard the king. Stand by him with your swords. If anyone tries to harm him, protect him with your life." The men surrounded the temple courtyard. Drums sounded. People turned, confused by the noise, until Jehoiada stepped forward, lifting a crown in his hands. The crowd gasped as a boy was led out of the temple, dressed in royal robes. Joash. The lost prince. The rightful king. Jehoiada raised his voice, loud and clear for all Jerusalem to hear. "Long live the king." The people stared in shock, then one by one, they began to cheer. First a whisper. Then a shout. Then a roar. "Long live the king! Long live the king!" Trumpets blasted. Swords were drawn. The earth itself seemed to shake with joy. For the first time in years, hope returned to Judah. But not everyone rejoiced. Far away in the palace, Athaliah heard the sound of the trumpets and the voices rising from the temple. Her face twisted with confusion, then rage. She screamed, "Treason! Treason!" And she rushed toward the temple, not knowing that her end was coming with every step. The sound of celebration echoed through the streets of Jerusalem. Trumpets sang. Voices soared. Long live the king! But deep inside the palace, those joyful sounds struck Athaliah like thunder. She stood frozen for a moment. The crown on her head seemed to grow heavier. The servants around her were silent, afraid to speak. Then, with a voice like lightning and eyes filled with fury, she screamed. "What is that noise? Who dares disturb my rule?" A messenger ran into the throne room, breathless and pale. "My queen, it's the temple. The priests have gathered a crowd. They've crowned a child, your grandson, Joash." Athaliah's heart skipped. Joash? Alive? She had ordered every royal child to be killed. She had made sure no heir remained. How could this be? Her lips curled into a snarl. Rage burned through her veins. Without waiting, she gathered her guards and stormed toward the temple. Down the palace steps. Through the gates. Across the stone paths. The noise grew louder. She could hear the drums, the cheers, the joyful cries of the people. It made her sick. When she reached the temple, the sight before her nearly knocked the breath from her chest. There he stood, Joash, only 7 years old, wearing the crown that should have been hers, standing beside Jehoiada the priest. The crowd surrounded him, clapping, shouting, worshipping God. The guards stood in perfect formation, swords in hand, eyes sharp. Not one of them moved to protect Athaliah. She stepped forward, lifting her arms in fury. Treason! Treason, she shouted. You dare raise up a child against your queen. But no one moved. No one answered. Because in their hearts, they knew, she was the traitor. The people turned against her. The guards did not bow. The priest stood firm. Athaliah looked around, her voice trembling with hate. You are fools. You will all die for this. But she was alone. Her army had vanished. Her power had slipped through her fingers like sand. For the first time in her life, she was not feared. Jehoiada raised his hand. Take her outside the temple, he commanded. Do not let her die here, in the house of the Lord. The guards moved toward her. Athaliah backed away, her eyes wide with shock. No. I am queen. You can't. But her voice faded as they dragged her through the gates. The same gates she had once ruled from. The same gates she had walked through in power, now echoed with her shame. Outside the temple walls, in a place where justice was carried out, Athaliah's reign came to an end. Her voice was silenced. Her throne was gone. And the darkness that had covered Judah for 6 years began to lift like a morning mist. Inside the temple, Joash looked up at Jehoiada. Am I really the king now? The priest knelt beside him and smiled. Yes, my child. And with God's help, you will be a better king than those before you. You are not just a boy. You are a promise. A light. A beginning. And so, while Athaliah's name would forever be remembered in shame, the name of Joash would rise in hope. The people rejoiced. The temple sang again. And heaven smiled over Judah. The temple was still glowing with the joy of Joash's crowning. Children laughed again. Mothers sang softly. Fathers looked at each other with tears in their eyes, nodding with pride. After 6 long years of darkness, the light had returned, not in the form of an army, or a mighty warrior, but through a boy, barely 7, chosen by God. Joash, the last surviving heir of David, was now king. But he wasn't alone. Beside him stood Jehoiada the priest, the man who had raised him, protected him, and prayed over him since the day he was rescued. Jehoiada stood not as a ruler, but as a guide, a godly father figure whose wisdom would shape the young king's first steps. And those first steps came quickly. Joash sat on the royal seat in the temple court, small hands gripping the sides of the carved wooden chair. His crown sat just a little too big on his head, and his feet didn't quite touch the floor. But his eyes, they were sharp and steady. He looked at Jehoiada. What should I do first? Joash asked. Should I build an army? A palace? Jehoiada smiled gently. No, my king. First, we restore what was stolen. We rebuild the house of the Lord. Joash turned and looked up at the temple walls. He saw the cracks, the broken stones, the faded gold. He saw the damage Athaliah's reign had caused, not just in people's hearts, but in the very place where God's presence dwelled. For years, the temple had been forgotten, stripped of its beauty and joy. Parts of it had even been given to idols. The songs had stopped. The lamps had dimmed. And the people had grown used to the silence. But not anymore. Joash stood to his feet. Let it be known through all of Judah, he said in his young but clear voice. We will repair the temple of the Lord. We will honor him first. The crowd clapped. Scribes rushed to record his words. Messengers were sent out to the towns and villages, calling craftsmen, carpenters, metal workers, and singers. Temple guards were reassigned to protect the workers. And for the first time in years, the sound of hammers and chisels rang through Jerusalem. The people gave offerings, gold, silver, wood, and oil. Children carried stones. Old men wept as they touched the temple walls again. And Joash visited the work daily. He asked questions. He thanked the builders. He prayed over the workers. Though he was still just a boy, he led with a heart full of purpose. He didn't just want to fix broken walls. He wanted to heal a broken people. And so, his first royal decree wasn't about war, or taxes, or ruling by force. It was about worship. It was about returning Judah to the God who had never abandoned them, even in their darkest hour. The people began to believe again. Not just in their king, but in the goodness of the Lord. They sang. They danced. And the temple slowly came back to life. By the time the sun set that day, the streets buzzed with hope. Joash stood on the temple steps, his robes fluttering in the evening wind, and looked out over the city. "We are not lost," he whispered. "God has not forgotten us." And far above, in the quiet of the heavens, God smiled. The winds in Jerusalem felt different now. The fear that once clung to the air like thick smoke had started to clear. People were walking with lighter steps. Children were laughing again. The market was alive, and the temple was breathing again. Joash was king. Not a warrior king with battle scars or a loud voice, but a boy king with a quiet strength and a heart taught by truth. He was only 7 years old, but the people didn't mock his age, they marveled that he had survived. They saw his crown, but more than that, they saw God's mercy sitting on the throne. With Jehoiada the priest at his side, Joash ruled wisely. Day by day, Jehoiada taught him how to lead with justice, how to listen with patience, and most of all, how to honor the Lord above all things. Joash would sit in the temple courts, listening to the Levites sing. He watched as the temple walls were mended with fresh stones. He saw people give joyfully, gold, silver, wood, and oil, to rebuild the house of God. "We used to be afraid to give," one man whispered. "Now we give because we are free." Even the old men, who had survived Athaliah's reign, wept as they saw the temple restored. Their hands trembled as they touched the altar, remembering the days when darkness ruled and hope seemed lost. But now, hope had returned. As Joash grew, so did the kingdom. Fields bore fruit. Homes were repaired. People gathered to worship, not out of fear, but out of faith. And in every corner of Judah, the same words began to spread. "The boy king has brought back the heart of our people. God is with us again." But Joash never forgot where he came from. He would often walk through the halls of the palace where Athaliah once ruled. He would stop in the corridors and whisper to himself. "This is where the darkness sat, but it did not win." Sometimes at night, he'd light a lamp and stare at the flame. He didn't understand it all yet. But deep down, he knew that his life was a miracle, a small light that refused to go out, even when the whole kingdom had gone cold. And the people knew it too. They didn't just celebrate Joash because he was king. They celebrated him because he was proof that God never forgets his promise. The crown rested on Joash's head. Not just as a symbol of power, but as a reminder of pain, survival, and divine mercy. He was no longer just a boy hidden behind temple walls. He was the king of Judah, the last branch of David's line, spared by grace, raised by faith, and guided by a man who feared God more than kings. At his side stood Jehoiada, the high priest whose courage had saved a baby and preserved a kingdom. Together, they ruled with wisdom and righteousness. Under Jehoiada's careful guidance, Joash made decisions that honored the Lord. Idols were torn down. The temple was rebuilt. The people turned from fear to faith. Justice flowed like water in the streets again, and families gathered without dread of betrayal. But even in peace, the past whispered. Every time Joash passed the palace courtyard, he remembered. This was where his brothers were taken. This was where Athaliah ruled in blood. And that memory stayed with him. It didn't harden his heart, it humbled it. He ruled differently because he remembered differently. Athaliah's name became a warning spoken in hushed tones. When ambition silences love, even blood will not be spared. She was a queen who chose the throne over family. But Joash would be a king who chose faith over fear. He honored Jehoiada as a father. He listened when the old priest spoke. And he surrounded himself with godly advisers, men and women who remembered what had happened, and what it had cost. Joash's reign became a time of renewal. People sang again in the temple. Children were born into peace, not panic. And stories were told, around fires, in synagogues, beside city gates, of the boy who lived, the queen who fell, and the God who keeps his promises. But it wasn't just a happy ending. It was a holy beginning. Because Joash's survival wasn't just about saving a life, it was about continuing a promise made to King David. A promise that through David's line would come the Messiah. A Savior. A Redeemer. Joash didn't know it then, but in saving him, God was protecting the path that would one day lead to Jesus. And so, the story of blood and betrayal becomes a story of redemption. Yes, Athaliah ruled for a season. Yes, innocent blood was spilled. Yes, darkness had its moment. But in the end, God's promises outlasted the pain. What do we learn from this? That no matter how dark life becomes, no matter how broken a family, a kingdom, or a person may be, God never forgets his promises. Joash's life proves that evil may sit on a throne for a time. But God's justice always rises. And the legacy left behind? Not just one of bloodshed, but one of redemption, courage, and divine purpose. Athaliah tried to end a legacy. She used fear. She used blood. She used the throne. But she could not destroy what God had promised. Joash's survival wasn't luck. It was divine protection. His rise wasn't rebellion, it was restoration. And his reign reminds us that God's plan always outlasts man's evil. You see, the enemy may plot. The wicked may rise. But the line of David, the promises of God, they will never be broken. What about you? Is there a promise over your life that feels forgotten? Do you feel like darkness has taken too much from you? Let Joash's story remind you, you are not forgotten. You are not finished. God is still writing your story. If this powerful Bible story touched your heart, like the video. Subscribe to our channel for more cinematic Bible stories. Comment below, what stood out to you most in Joash's journey? And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story where faith rises and darkness falls. Until next time, remember. The Lord is faithful to all his promises, and loving toward all he has made. Psalm 145 verse 13.